do. People just need to take the normal precautions that you would take, the practical measures of at night, lock your door, know where your children are at, and keep track of your neighbors. That's a good thing to do.
If we don't get Dylan under control, we're all going to wake up dead one day. Rick G. said those words to his own mother as a warning, months before it happened. Weeks later, inside a house where nobody in town ever locked their doors, 5 members of his family tragically lost their lives, and a 3-year-old girl was left hiding in the dark, alone, for nearly 14 hours, waiting for someone to find her. Videos like this take real work. Days and nights of research go into every single case before it ever reaches your screen. If you value that effort, a like, a comment, and a subscribe is the support that keeps this channel going. Beason, Illinois, was never the kind of place this was supposed to happen. Fewer than 200 people lived there. There was no police department, no traffic light, nothing that marked it out from 100 other small towns scattered across the flat farmland of central Illinois. If something went wrong in the middle of the night, you called the Logan County Sheriff's Office, and you waited, sometimes 20 minutes, sometimes longer, because the nearest deputy was never close. That was simply how life worked here. People left their doors unlocked without thinking about it. Neighbors knew each other's cars, each other's kids, each other's routines. It was the kind of place where a stranger's truck rolling down the road after midnight was memorable, precisely because nothing here was ever that interesting. At the edge of town lived Rick G. He was known by everyone who knew him as a hard-working man, the kind of person who didn't complain, who simply put his head down and did what needed doing. He'd lost his own father young and grew up learning that nothing came easy. He started out working construction jobs for his stepfather, a man everyone called Pudge, saving whatever he could, until he had enough to buy a piece of land at the edge of Beason and build a life of his own. He called his company G Construction. It was small, but it was his. He built a ranch-style home with a detached garage, an above-ground pool, some farmland where he kept chickens. When money was tight, as it sometimes is for a man running his own small business, he did the practical thing. He rented out a spare room. That's how Ruth came into his life. She moved in as his tenant, a warm, funny, outgoing woman raising 2 young children on her own, Justina and Dylan. What began as landlord and tenant became something else entirely, and in 1997, Rick and Ruth married, blending their 2 families into one. Rick's teenage daughter, Nicole, from a previous relationship, Ruth's 2 kids, and soon, children of their own. A daughter first, born with a serious neurological condition that left her needing round-the-clock care no facility in Beason could provide. A heartbreak the family carried quietly, having to place her 50 miles away, in Peoria, in a home equipped to give her what they couldn't. Then a son, Austin, and finally, years later, the baby of the family, a little girl named Tabitha. On the surface, it was a full, ordinary household, the kind of blended, chaotic, loving home a lot of families in small towns like this one build for themselves. Friends used to joke that they were the real-life Brady Bunch, a big, mismatched family that somehow worked. But underneath that ordinary rhythm, there was a thread of worry that never fully went away, and it centered on Dylan. He wasn't, by any honest account, a bad kid. Teachers who knew him described him as funny, restless, the kind of boy who'd goof off just to get a laugh out of a room, who doted on his baby sister Tabitha like she hung the moon. He wrestled for his school's team. He rode bikes around town with his little brother Austin, the 2 of them practically inseparable. But he also struggled with attention, with impulse control, and was eventually diagnosed with attention deficit disorder by his family physician, Dr. Philip Rossi. Medication helped for a while. Consistency didn't last. He was referred to a therapist, Olivia Messina, for a more thorough psychological evaluation, but he missed enough appointments that she was never able to complete it. Treatment quietly fell away by the end of 2007, right around the time Rick's construction business began to slow down, and money got tighter, and the family had less and less room to focus on getting their son the help he might have needed. There were disciplinary reports from school, dozens over the years, most of them minor. The ordinary friction of a distractible kid who talked when he shouldn't have, who couldn't always sit still. But some incidents ran darker, sharp enough that Rick and Ruth genuinely worried, in private, about what their son might be capable of if things didn't change. Rick never said much about it outside the family, but there was one conversation with his own mother, Judy, that would come to mean more than either of them could have known. He told her plainly that he was afraid, that if Dylan didn't get real help, something terrible might happen. If they didn't get him under control, he said, they'd all wake up dead one day. It was the kind of thing a frightened parent says and immediately regrets, an exaggeration born of love and worry, never meant to travel further than that conversation. Judy filed it away. Nobody could have known it was about to become the first thread in a story that would consume a small town for years. By the summer of 2009, life in the G household had, in most respects, settled into something ordinary again. 16-year-old Justona had recently become a born-again Christian and spent her summer at a local Bible club with Austin. Dylan, 14 now, had started helping his father on construction jobs when he wasn't in school, working off some of that restless energy in a way that seemed to be doing him good. Rick's eldest daughter, Nicole, married to a local man named Chris Harris, had just welcomed their second child in late July, and the extended family had spent the following weeks helping fix up her house. Pudge and his grandson, Adam, were there that very week, laying new carpet, getting the place ready for a baby who'd soon be crawling. Sunday, September the 20th, began like any other night. Next door, a woman named Natalie Kleena, partially deaf, more comfortable typing than speaking on the phone, sat messaging back and forth with Ruth on the computer, the way they often did while waiting for their own kids to fall asleep. It was nothing important, just two friends passing the evening. At one point, Ruth mentioned that Dylan was still awake in his room, lost in a video game the way he often was. Small talk continued past 10 o'clock, then 11. Rick and Ruth took turns answering, passing the laptop back and forth between them the way people do when they're relaxed and unhurried, in no rush to be anywhere else. Just after midnight, Natalie sent something small and ordinary, a complaint about being hungry, nothing in the house to eat. A reply came back within minutes. Then, around 1 in the morning, Natalie sent one more message. No response came back. She sent another, a short while later, a little more pointed this time. Still nothing. She didn't think much of it. People fall asleep. She had no reason in that moment to imagine that just a short distance away, everything had already gone catastrophically, irreversibly wrong. The next afternoon unfolded like any other in Beason, right up until a 10-year-old boy named Sean, riding his brand-new bike over to show his friend Dylan, rounded the driveway of the G house and froze. Blood was smeared across the porch, dark and unmistakable. The front door stood open, just slightly. He called out. No one answered. Something in him, some instinct a 10-year-old shouldn't have to rely on, told him not to go inside. He turned and rode as hard as he could toward help, finding Rick's stepfather, Pudge, and his grandson, Adam, laying carpet nearby. Sean barely had the words to explain what he'd seen. only that something was wrong at Dylan's house, and they needed to go. Now. Adam reached the porch first. He saw the blood Sean had described, and beside it, at the bottom of the steps, a knife lying where it had no business being. He stepped inside anyway, felt along the wall in the dark for a light switch, calling out Rick's name, then Austin's, into a silence that gave nothing back. When the light finally came on, it revealed an image that would follow him for the rest of his life. Rick, lying unresponsive in the hallway amidst a devastating scene. Adam didn't dare go any further. He turned and ran back outside, telling Pudge to call 911, though he barely knew what to tell the dispatcher himself. He hadn't gone deeper into the house. He didn't yet know how much worse it was going to get. It was around this time that Nicole herself arrived, wondering why her grandfather and cousin hadn't come back to finish the carpet job. She found Pudge and Adam outside, shaken, and begged them to tell her if her family was okay. When they told her something had happened, she pleaded with Pudge to go inside and check on Ruth and the children, especially her 3-year-old sister, Tabitha. Pudge went in on his own, and what he saw took him to his knees. Adam had to pull him back outside, just as the first patrol car turned onto the gravel road. 12 minutes had passed since the call went out. Corporal Michael Block and Trooper Paul Hennessy crossed the threshold with their weapons drawn, uncertain whether whoever had done this was still somewhere inside. They found Rick just past the entryway and understood immediately that this was worse than anything either man had trained for. A pool of blood 2 to 3 feet wide, damage to the hallway walls, as if something, or someone, had been thrown against them with real force. They pushed deeper anyway, because if anyone else in that house was still alive, every second mattered. They found Ruth in the main bedroom, having suffered fatal blunt force trauma. 11-year-old Austin was found in the attached bathroom, bearing clear marks of a violent struggle before succumbing to his injuries. 14-year-old Dylan just outside the bedroom door, wearing only a pair of shorts, his injuries the worst either officer had encountered in their careers up to that point. Each room delivered another layer of horror neither officer had words for, and still they kept moving, because stopping wasn't an option yet. They found 16-year-old Justina last, in her bedroom, lying across her bed, and by then it felt certain they had found everyone there was to find. They checked one more room out of procedure, more than expectation. At first glance, it looked empty. Then Corporal Block's eyes moved toward the closet, and there, in the dark, was the smallest victim of the night, a 3-year-old girl, still and silent, suffering from a severe head injury. He knelt down anyway. It's what training tells you to do, even when you expect nothing back. And then he saw it, a small movement, a tiny hand, lifting off the floor. "She's alive," he called out, his voice cutting through a silence that had swallowed everything else in that house. Hennessy was at her side in seconds, afraid to move her too much, speaking softly, asking if she could hear him. She responded, small, but real. Tabitha, the baby of the family, had survived a night that had taken everyone else from her, alone in that closet for close to 14 hours. Paramedics rushed her out to begin the hour-long race to the nearest hospital, equipped to treat injuries like hers, St. Francis Medical Center in Peoria. No one standing in that yard could say yet whether she would survive the drive, let alone the surgery waiting for her once she arrived. Doctors would perform emergency neurosurgery to relieve critical pressure on her brain, but she was breathing. In a night that had delivered nothing but loss, it was the one fragile, impossible piece of hope anyone had left to hold on to. Word spread through Beason before the police had confirmed anything publicly. A 10-year-old boy running through town screaming that a family was dead. Neighbors gathering on porches, watching ambulance lights flash against the tree line. By the next morning, the coroner had made the calls no one wanted to receive, and Rick's mother Judy was asked to travel down and identify her son, his wife, and 4 of their children from photographs, because the injuries were too severe for anything else. 6 people were targeted in the attack, one of them, miraculously, still clinging to life. It was, without exaggeration, the worst thing this small community had ever lived through. Beason had no resources for a crime of this scale, and within hours, more than a dozen law enforcement agencies had converged on a town that had never seen anything close to this. Inside the house, investigators recovered a bloody handprint on a bathroom vanity, carefully preserved. Outside, in the dirt near the home, a single distinct shoe print matched to a specific brand, K-Swiss. Evidence that meant nothing yet, because there was no suspect to compare it against. They had one real lead, a neighbor who remembered an unfamiliar truck passing by around midnight, gray primer paint, strange homemade exhaust pipes rising up through the truck bed. Behind the cab, investigators pulled over anything close to that description. They commissioned a composite sketch and released it to the public. Tips poured in from as far away as Washington, D.C. Detectives checked hospitals within a 200-mile radius, working on the theory that whoever had done this, in a struggle that violent, must have been injured themselves. None of it led anywhere. Meanwhile, the town itself was changing. Beason had always been the kind of place where nobody thought twice about an unlocked door. That sense of safety didn't survive September of 2009. People who'd never owned a firearm suddenly kept one loaded within reach. Families who once let their kids roam free until dark started calling them home early. And a quiet, uneasy suspicion crept into ordinary interactions, because whoever had done this hadn't driven in from some distant city and vanished. They were still out there, somewhere close, possibly still nodding hello at the gas station or the post office. Investigators also turned to Nicole, the one immediate family member they could speak with. She had an alibi. She'd been at work that night. But detectives questioned her thoroughly anyway, the way they would anyone close to the victims. She talked them through her family, their friends, anyone who might have wanted to hurt them, and came up empty. She couldn't imagine anyone doing this. From there, they turned naturally to her husband, Chris Harris, who'd known the family since he and Nicole started dating as teenagers. He told police he and his brother Jason had been out at a bar the night of the murders, a story Jason corroborated. Neither man had visible injuries. For the moment, investigators moved on, no closer to an answer, 48 hours into a case that was already going cold. At the hospital, Tabitha remained the only living witness to what had happened, and officers guarded her door around the clock, screening every visitor. It was there, in the most unremarkable of circumstances, that the case finally broke open. On September the 30th, an officer finishing his shift stepped into an elevator beside a familiar, almost invisible presence. Chris Harris, who'd been at Nicole's side constantly since the news broke, who by every appearance was simply a devastated family member helping hold what remained of his wife's world together. The officer had no particular reason to look at him twice. Then, almost by accident, his eyes dropped to the man's shoes. A pair of K-Swiss sneakers, the same brand as the print found outside the G home. It might have meant nothing. Chris had every reason to have left footprints around that house before, having dropped his own children off there more times than anyone could count. But something about it didn't sit right, and the officer passed the observation up the chain. Chris was brought in for questioning and cooperated on the surface, handing over his shoes, his fingerprints, his palm prints, giving investigators no outward reason to suspect him. His shoes were a close match to the cast taken from the scene, but a size and a half too big. His truck was the right rough gray primer color, but without the strange exhaust pipes witnesses had described. Nothing conclusive yet. Investigators dug into his past anyway. A decade-old theft conviction, minor offenses, nothing violent. They pulled his and Nicole's old divorce file, filed years earlier, and found her handwritten note beside her stated reason of mental cruelty. Some physical cruelty as well, unexplained, unelaborated. It wasn't proof of anything. Nicole had, after all, taken him back, and the two had recently had a second child together. But it was one more thread investigators couldn't quite let go of. Then came a woman named Lori Cole, an armed security guard, who came forward describing a strange encounter that same night. A man she didn't recognize knocking on her door around 11:30, asking if she wanted to party, refusing to take no for an answer until she told him plainly she needed to sleep for work. She remembered a Ford Ranger-style truck parked outside. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. Now it placed Chris and his brother Jason less than 20 minutes from the G house, less than an hour before the messages to Natalie Clean stopped coming. Telephone records backed it up. Chris had borrowed a phone at a nearby bar just after 11 that night, a call lasting about 10 minutes, before he and Jason were seen finishing their drinks and leaving. Then came a truck stop employee who remembered Chris driving a primer gray pickup during his time working there. Then came the search of his truck, where investigators found the G family's missing laptop hidden under a tarp. Then, behind the shed at the house where Chris was staying with his brother Jason, a chrome weight rack, recently moved, recently hidden, that, when placed in the truck bed as a test, created almost exactly the illusion of the exhaust pipes a witness had described. And finally, the piece of evidence that changed everything. The bloody handprint recovered from the bathroom vanity was matched to Christopher Harris. He was arrested on October the 1st and charged with 5 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. The town reacted with disbelief. Chris wasn't a stranger. He was family, or close enough, a man who'd dropped his own children off at that house for years. His stepmother told reporters there was no way that he'd never had a violent bone in his body. Nicole herself, devastated and defiant, publicly defended him, insisting there was hard evidence her family had fought for their lives and that Chris didn't have a single scratch on him. He wasn't capable of this, she said. Even a former girlfriend, Christy Moore, who'd seen him the very morning after the murders, would later testify he'd seemed completely normal, that the only mark on him was a small blister on his palm, which he told her had come from trimming trees. But investigators had already turned their attention to the one person who might actually know the truth, Chris's younger brother, Jason, who'd provided him an alibi for that night. As the case tightened, Jason's own charges escalated to match his brother's. 5 counts of murder, 1 count of attempted murder, and whatever loyalty had kept him quiet began to buckle under the weight of his own survival. He started to talk. What he gave investigators wasn't a clean, consistent account. Over the following months, he would offer more than a dozen shifting versions of that night, each one bending slightly to protect himself a little more. But certain details never changed. A night out of heavy drinking and reckless behavior. A search for female company that led nowhere. And finally, the drive to the G house. He described waiting in the truck, hearing sounds from inside he could never unhear. Thuds, screaming. Watching Dylan burst through a window bleeding. Watching his brother confront him outside with a heavy tool in hand, overpowering him, while Dylan called out for help. But it was what Jason said next that mattered most. Not what he claimed to witness that night, but what Chris told him the following day, almost matter-of-factly, laying it out room by room. He'd gone into Justina's bedroom with a metal tool hidden behind his back and asked if she wanted to go out. She said no. Dylan came in asking what he was hiding behind his back, and from there, Chris told him. Everything happened fast. Justina first, then Rick, who came in and was struck hard enough that Chris believed he'd broken his jaw. Then Ruth, then Austin, each one falling in almost the exact order the crime scene itself would later suggest. Jason also admitted, under questioning, that he'd burned his brother's bloodied clothes, hidden the stolen laptop, and lied to police about the alibi. obstruction charges of his own on top of everything else. It was, without question, the most damning account anyone had given, and it directly contradicted the story Chris was about to tell in his own defense, that he'd arrived at 1 a.m. simply to buy some illegal stuff from Rick, that he'd found the house silent, and as his eyes adjusted, discovered the horror already in progress, that he'd walked in on 14-year-old Dylan holding a weapon, and that everything he'd done that night had been an act of self-defense against a boy who was no longer alive to say otherwise. The trial began in May of 2013, nearly 4 years after that first ordinary night, moved to Peoria because pre-trial publicity had made an unbiased jury impossible to find at home. The defense built its entire case around recasting Dylan, his ADHD diagnosis from Dr. Rossi, a therapist's incomplete assessment from Olivia Messina, and testimony from a psychologist named Dr. Craig Anderson, who listed a series of generic risk factors for violence, video games, a difficult home life, economic hardship, and then admitted, under cross-examination, that none of it could actually predict what a real person would or wouldn't do, and that he'd never even performed a formal evaluation of Dylan himself. 250 school disciplinary incidents sounded damning in the abstract, until it became clear most of them were minor, talking out of turn, tossing a notebook off a desk, the ordinary chaos of a distractible teenager, not the record of someone building toward mass violence. The state answered with the people who had actually known him. A special education teacher who broke down on the stand, remembering how Dylan used to dance his way to the pencil sharpener just to make her laugh. Another teacher who said all it ever took to calm him down was a conversation. His wrestling coach, who remembered spirit, not aggression. A kid proud just to be part of a team, new to the sport, without the killer instinct some other wrestlers carried. Even the town postmaster, who had watched Dylan and his siblings grow up waiting for the school bus every morning, said the same thing everyone else did. He was a good kid. And then came the forensic evidence that ultimately dismantled the defense's entire theory. A blood spatter expert testified that whoever struck Justina would have been sprayed extensively with blood along their legs and lower body, given her position on the bed. But Dylan, wearing only shorts that night, had barely any spatter on his bare skin. His hand injuries, meanwhile, were severe enough that wielding a heavy object with significant force would have been medically impossible. The state also pointed out that while Rick's DNA was found under Dylan's fingernails, that alone proved nothing more than that they lived in the same house together. It did not place a weapon in Dylan's hands. Chris took the stand in his own defense, tearful, insistent, describing a scene of horror he said he'd simply walked into, finding Rick unresponsive in the hallway, Ruth bloodied against a dresser, Austin still breathing on the bathroom floor before he turned and saw Dylan standing there, knife raised, covered in blood. But the jury had already heard his own brother's account of what he'd confided the very next morning. Justina, then Rick, then Ruth, then Austin, in the exact order the crime scene itself told. It was one story too many to reconcile with the physical evidence in front of them. On May the 31st, 2013, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty on every count. 5 counts of first-degree murder, attempted murder, aggravated battery of a child, home invasion, armed robbery. One juror, a 19-year-old who'd grown up in the same small community as the G's, later admitted he'd spent the entire trial searching for a reason to believe Chris wasn't guilty, and simply couldn't find one. He didn't fully believe Jason's testimony either. He didn't need to. The evidence spoke clearly enough on its own. On July the 19th, Chris was sentenced to 5 consecutive terms of natural life for the murders, plus 30 years for attempted murder, 30 years for home invasion, and 20 years for armed robbery, a sentence that guaranteed he would never again draw breath as a free man. Before it was handed down, the courtroom heard from the people left behind. Nicole, once his fiercest defender, told him plainly that he'd had everything and thrown it all away, that he was nothing to her or her children anymore. Rick's mother read two statements, one written from the perspective of the little girl who had survived, describing how Tabitha had refused to let the horror of that night define the rest of her life, and one addressed directly to Chris, asking only that he be shown the same mercy he had shown her son and his family. And then Tabitha herself, 7 years old by then, spoke. Her words were simple, the way a child's words are, and somehow more devastating for it. She said she wished he were dead instead, and that her mother and father and brothers and sister were alive. She said you don't sneak up on people. She said he needed to say sorry because he had broken her heart. Jason received 10 years in exchange for his testimony, a decision that has never stopped being debated, given how many moments he'd had that night to do something, anything, to stop what was happening inside that house. Moments when he heard Dylan calling out for help and chose to stay in the truck. His girlfriend Jennifer and her mother, who had provided the initial false alibi, received probation and fines for their role in obstructing the investigation. In the years since, the town has tried, in whatever way a town like this can, to hold on to what it lost. A playground now stands in Beason, dedicated to Austin, Dylan, and Justina, a quiet, ordinary place where children play, mostly unaware of the story behind it. Tabitha, remarkably, made a full physical recovery, though doctors believe the head trauma she suffered spared her the memory of that night altogether. She spent time in foster care before eventually being raised by her sister, Nicole, growing up in the shadow of a tragedy she cannot consciously recall, but will never fully escape. And when a later television documentary tried once again to paint Dylan as the violent one, the very investigators who had worked the case felt compelled to speak up publicly and set the record straight, writing that the boy deserved to be remembered not as a suspect, but as what the evidence had always shown him to be. Dylan Constant did not kill his family. He was 14 years old, and by every piece of evidence that ultimately mattered, he ran. And then he ran back inside, not away from the danger, but toward the people he loved, in the last desperate act of a boy trying, against every impossible odd, to save them. This case still leaves a lot to sit with. Imagine if Rick's fear had been taken seriously in time. Drop your thoughts below. Was 10 years enough for Jason, given everything he could have stopped? Would you have believed Chris's self-defense story if his own brother hadn't talked? And what do you think should change so a kid like Dylan never gets misrepresented like this again? If this story stayed with you the way it stayed with us, hit like, tell us your take in the comments, and subscribe so you never miss the next case.